The good old black plantation driver, sometimes helpful and many times hated. What exactly was his duty, and how did he perform it during the Civil War? When the opportunity was available, was he faithful to his master, or did he flee like some of the others? We shall see as we commence our study from Dr. Litwack's 1979 book, Been in the Storm So Long, The Aftermath of Slavery. Let's beginneth.
No plantation slave exercised greater authority than did the driver or foreman. The position he occupied as the director of labor and as an intermediary between the big house and the quarters made him a crucial figure in the wartime crisis and in the subsequent transition to free labor.
The driver functioned as a middleman on the plantation, sometimes in the middle of the master and the slaves, sometimes between the overseer and the slaves. And his job was this.
The driver dispatched the slaves to the fields, set the work pace and supervised performance of the daily tasks, maintained order in the quarters, settled disputes among slaves, and shared supervisory duties with the overseer, or, quite commonly, combined the functions of driver and overseer. In a conflict between the overseer and the driver's judgment might in many instances prevail. The very maintenance of discipline often demanded that his authority be sustained.
I constantly endeavored to do nothing which would cause them to lose their respect for him,
the manager of a plantation in South Carolina noted.
That's referring to not embarrassing or humiliating the driver in front of the slaves. The master needed the masses of the slaves to respect the driver, so the driver could influence them to work and be productive and make him money.
With that same objective in mind, many planters provided the driver with better clothing, granted certain privileges to his wife, and always made a point of reprimanding him in private rather than in the presence of other slaves.
Working with polarities right here, giving the driver a few more perks, created a gap in perceived status between the driver and the slave. This is the same game the European rulers played with the poor Europeans in early America. They turned them into white people and gave them certain rights that were stripped away from those called Negroes. And it created this gap in status, which the poor whites became addicted to heavily, and they were willing to do nearly anything to keep it, right? It's the same game on a smaller scale with the driver by giving him additional benefits that had been stripped away from the rest of the slaves to make himself feel special and the rest of the slaves to look at him as special. Understand?
In the literature and folklore of slavery, the driver enjoyed at best a mixed reputation, usually reflecting the ways in which he exerted his power to exact labor and mete out punishments. If the Uncle Toms came to dominate the legend of the house slave, the black Simon Legrees seemed to prevail in the characterization of the driver. Henry Cheatham, a former Mississippi slave, recalled the driver as
the meanest devil that ever lived on the Lord's green earth. I promised myself when I growed up that I was going to kill that if and it was the last thing I ever done.
You see that? In his view, this driver was the worst. He wasn't looking to kill the slave master when he growed up. He wanted to kill that N-word. And from the driver's view, he probably felt like he did what needed to be done to keep his status and benefits. He didn't want to be a regular slave like everyone else. And if that required him to be mean, then he would do just that.
To make matters worse, that driver, along with the mistress, ran the plantation after the death of the master in the war.
Uh-oh.
After the war, on those plantations where the driver had a reputation for cruelty, the freedmen demanded his removal before they would consent to work. If a master maintained confidence in any of his slaves, outside of a few of the venerable uncles and aunties, he most likely trusted the driver. He had personally chosen this man for his loyalty, competence, and dependability, believing him capable of managing the plantation in his absence. But the master also selected a driver who commanded the respect and obedience of the slaves, and this leadership role was apt to create conflicting loyalties.
So this was a person who was likely a natural leader. And when you think about it from the master's perspective, it was a wise move to create the role of the driver, because in many ways, this position neutralized the revolting leader type, right? By finding the leader and then giving him some authority and privileges, they were able to get him to work for the master instead of against him. right? These were the strategic games they played, and you have to learn to think just like them to reverse engineer the game.
When the Yankees arrived, numerous drivers exercised leadership and influence in ways few masters had dared to contemplate. On one of the Alston plantations, Jesse Bellflowers, the much-harassed overseer, traced the prevailing disorder and the misconduct of the slaves to the driver.
He is not behaving right,
Bellflowers reported.
He don't talk right before the people.
In this instance, the driver went rogue. He wasn't performing the duties as expected from him, and he led the people into misconduct and disorder.
Not far from this scene, Confederate scouts captured and hanged a driver for his treachery.
Him too. He switched sides and the thing had been discovered. So they sent him back to the realm of negative existence before he could encourage any others to rebel.
When a number of slaves fled a Georgia plantation to join General Sherman's army, the leading spirit as well as the youngest of the group was the driver, described by one Union officer as a
very quick and manly fellow, a model, physically.
Not only did some drivers desert to the Yankees, but they were likely as well to take other slaves with them, and in several instances the driver directed the seizure of deserted plantations and helped to wreak vengeance on masters and overseers.
So the driver could play both roles, which made him potentially dangerous. He could be for or against the plantation depending on his character, the circumstances, and his goals.
A South Carolina planter and his son were shot and seriously wounded while riding in their carriage near the plantation. The band of blacks who ambushed them had been led on by his driver. After blacks had seized one of his plantations, Charles Manigault accused the driver of aspiring to be
lord and master of everything there. Frederick was ringleader, and at the head of all the iniquity committed there. He encouraged all the Negroes to believe that the farm and everything on it, now since emancipation, belonged solely to him, and that their former owners had now no rights or control there whatever.
This was big talk coming from a Negro in the South at that time. Frederick was unbelievably bold.
No less dismayed, Edmund Ruffin described the exodus of blacks from his son's plantation, Marlborn, along with the decision of those who remained to refuse to work.
My former black overseer, Jem Sykes,
he added,
who for the last 7 years of my proprietorship kept my keys and was trusted with everything, even when I and every other white was absent from 4 to 6 weeks at a time, acted precisely with all his fellows.
Another highly trusted slave that went rogue. Jim was a real team player.
If the driver remained on the plantation, as he usually did, he might also assume the responsibility for informing the slaves of their freedom and initiating negotiations with the master for a labor contract. When some planters came to assess the wartime disaster that deprived them of an enslaved workforce, they did not hesitate to project much of their anger and frustration on the trusted drivers.
The drivers everywhere have proved the worst Negroes,
A Louisiana planter concluded. Actually, the record varied considerably, and as many planters voiced satisfaction and admiration for the ways in which their drivers managed to sustain agricultural operations and control the labor force during the war, and in some instances run the entire plantation in their absence.
So the results were situational. Some drivers tore the roof off, and others kept it on and ran the entire plantation while the owner ran off hiding.
With a number of slaves manifesting their discontent, Louis Manigault was much relieved to learn that driver John
is still the same,
and since he deemed John
a man of great importance
to the plantation, Manigault advised his father to furnish him with all the items the driver had requested: boots, a coat, a hat, a watch, and ample clothing.
John stayed faithful. Reward him with the little gifts he wants.
On the South Carolina Sea Islands, particularly on the smaller plantations, the drivers remained after the masters fled and succeeded in supervising and planting food crops and in maintaining a semblance of order and discipline. Impressed with the leadership and knowledge of plantation operations exhibited by these drivers, Union officers viewed them as a crucial stabilizing factor in the transition to free labor and tried to bolster their authority, particularly on the larger plantations where it had been seriously undermined by the absence of whites. Recognizing the influence many of the drivers retained over the freed slaves, planters went to considerable lengths after the war to maintain their services. Once again, the driver found himself caught between conflicting loyalties. Through the driver, the planter hoped to retain the bulk of his labor force on the most favorable terms, though in a few instances he would have to dismiss an unpopular driver to keep any of his former slaves. Through the driver, on the other hand, many former slaves hoped to present a united front to the employer and exact concessions from him that would make their labor sufficiently remunerative and less arduous.
The driver acted as a spokesman and negotiator for the group. He helped negotiate better working conditions and the terms of compensation.
In many of these post-war arrangements, the planter and the driver, both leaders in their own ways, seemed to have reached a tacit understanding about the division of power. On a plantation near Lexington, Tennessee, the driver Jordan Piles had fled with the Yankees and had served in the Union Army. When he returned to the plantation after the war, he
was a changed and all the whites and a lot of the hated him.
His stepson recalled.
All excepting old master, and he never said a word out of the way to him. Just told him to come on and work on the place as long as he wanted to.
Whatever the hostility that initially greeted him, Jordan Piles must have retained much of the leadership quality and influence he had previously exercised, for in 1867 he would be elected a delegate to the Radical State Convention.
And that's some of the get down on the driver during the Civil War. He could be made use of or use himself in various ways. Some loved him and others hated him, but either way he played his part. And so with that, we continue to the next. I thank you for watching all the way until the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.